The frozen earth crunched beneath James Chen's boots as he slipped out of the cabin into the pre-dawn darkness. His breath came in white plumes that vanished into the Wyoming winter like ghosts. The boy was 14 years old, but the weight he carried made him feel ancient. In his trembling hands, he held his father's hunting rifle. A Winchester .22 caliber worn smooth by years of use, its blued steel catching what little starlight penetrated the heavy clouds above. James checked the chamber with practiced fingers, though his hands shook from more than just the cold. 2 bullets, that was all that remained. 2 bullets between his family and starvation. The temperature sat at 20 degrees below zero, the kind of cold that turned spit to ice before it hit the ground, the kind that killed men who made mistakes. James pulled his father's old coat tighter around his thin frame, feeling how loose it hung on him now. 4 months of hunger had stripped the fat from his bones, left him lean and hard in ways no 14-year-old should be. He moved through the snow with careful steps, following the tree line north, where he had spotted rabbit tracks the day before. Each step sank 6 inches deep into powder that sparkled like crushed diamonds in the starlight. Behind him, the cabin sat dark and silent. His mother would wake soon, find him gone, and know exactly what he was attempting. She would not stop him. She could not. There was no choice left. James found the tracks where he remembered them, fresh enough that snow had not yet filled them completely. The rabbit had come this way recently, probably within the last 2 hours, moving from one stand of sagebrush to another, in search of whatever sustenance could be found in this frozen wasteland. James followed the trail, his eyes scanning the white expanse for any sign of movement, any hint of brown fur against the endless white. 40 minutes passed. The eastern sky began to lighten from black to deep purple. James's feet had gone numb inside his worn boots. His fingers felt like wooden sticks wrapped around the rifle stock, but he could not go back. Would not. Not without meat. Then he saw it. A flash of movement near a cluster of rocks 60 yards ahead. The rabbit emerged, nose twitching, ears alert. A snowshoe hare, its winter coat almost perfectly camouflaged against the snow. Only its black eyes and the shadow it cast gave it away. James dropped slowly to one knee, his heart hammering so hard he thought the rabbit might hear it. He raised the rifle, settling the stock against his shoulder, the way his father had taught him 3 years ago, back when the world still made sense, back when they had food in the pantry and hope in their hearts. The wind gusted from the northwest at 15 miles per hour. James could feel it pushing against his right cheek. He would need to aim left to compensate. The rifle sights wavered as his arms trembled. Steady, he told himself. Steady. His father's voice echoed in his memory. Breathe out slow. Hold. Squeeze. Don't pull. James exhaled half his breath and held it. His finger tightened on the trigger. The rabbit hopped 2 feet to the left, stopped, began to nibble at something beneath the snow. James adjusted his aim. The crosshairs settled on the rabbit's shoulder. Now or never, he squeezed. The rifle cracked, the sound sharp and final in the frozen silence. The rabbit jerked, twisted, and bolted. James's heart sank like a stone through black water. Missed. He had missed. 1 bullet left. 1 bullet for his mother, his brothers, his sister. 1 bullet between them and death. The rabbit disappeared behind a boulder. James stood, his legs shaking so badly he nearly fell. He had failed. Failed his family. Failed his father's memory. Failed everything. Then he heard it. A high keening sound. Pain. The rabbit was hurt. James ran stumbling through the deep snow, the rifle clutched in both hands. He rounded the boulder, and there it was, the rabbit dragging itself in a circle, its back legs shattered by the bullet that had not missed after all that had clipped it, just enough to bring it down. The boy dropped to his knees and grabbed the wounded animal with both hands. It struggled weakly, its heart racing beneath his palms. James felt tears burning his eyes, freezing on his cheeks before they could fall. He thought of his father, of the last time they had hunted together, of the gentle way Thomas Chen had taught him to respect the animals they took to honor their sacrifice, to never cause unnecessary suffering. With quick practice movements, James ended the rabbit's pain. He sat back in the snow, the small, warm body in his hands, and let himself cry. Not from sadness, though there was that too, but from relief so profound it felt like a physical blow. They would eat today. His little sister Sarah would have meat in her belly. His brother David would not go to bed with hunger gnawing at his insides. His mother would not have to pretend she was not hungry while dividing nothing into smaller portions of nothing. James tucked the rabbit inside his coat, feeling its warmth against his chest, and began the long walk home. The sun was rising now, painting the snowfields pink and gold, transforming the frozen wilderness into something almost beautiful. But James knew the truth beneath the beauty. This land was trying to kill them. Had been trying since the day his father died 8 months ago. Every day was a battle, every meal a victory snatched from the jaws of defeat. When he reached the cabin, smoke was rising from the chimney. His mother had woke and built up the fire, was probably boiling water for what passed as breakfast these days. Hot water with a few grains of rice, a soup of air and hope. The door opened before he could knock. Eleanor Chen stood framed in the doorway, her face gaunt, her eyes too large in her thin face, her black hair pulled back in a severe bun. She was 30 years old but looked 50. Grief and hunger had aged her in ways that seemed impossible. She saw the bulge in James's coat, and her hand went to her mouth. No words. She did not need words. She pulled him inside, wrapped her arms around him, and held him tight enough that he could feel her ribs through her worn dress. Behind her, David and Sarah watched with wide eyes. Eleanor took the rabbit from James with trembling hands. She turned it over, examining it with the practiced eye of someone who had stretched every resource to its absolute limit. 1 rabbit, maybe 2 pounds of meat once cleaned, 3 people to feed. But it was something, it was everything. She looked at her son. This boy who had become the man of the family far too young, and saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of responsibility that no child should carry. James met her gaze steadily. He did not flinch, did not look away. In that moment, Eleanor saw both her dead husband and her living son, past and future, merged in the determined set of his jaw. "You did well," she said quietly. "Your father would be proud." James nodded once, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He sat down heavily at the rough wooden table while his mother set to work preparing their Christmas dinner. 1 rabbit for 3 children and their mother. A feast by their current standards. A tragedy by any other measure. The cabin was small, barely 20 feet on each side, with a loft above where the children slept, and a single room below that served as kitchen living area in Eleanor's bedroom. The walls were chinked with mud and moss, but winter winds still found their way through. The floor was packed earth swept clean each day, by habit more than necessity. A cast iron stove squatted in one corner, its fire the only thing standing between them and freezing to death. This was what remained of Thomas Chen's dream. He had come to America from Guangdong province in 1873, 13 years ago, working on the Transcontinental Railroad with thousands of other Chinese laborers. He had saved every penny, denied himself every comfort, sent most of his wages back to his family in China. But he had kept enough to buy his freedom from the railroad company, enough to make his way to San Francisco, where he met Eleanor, the daughter of a merchant whose business had failed, whose family had fallen from prosperity to poverty in a single season of bad luck. Thomas had courted her with quiet determination. He was not handsome, not wealthy, not even particularly charming. But he was steady, reliable. He had a plan. He would homestead in Wyoming, claim the 160 acres the government offered to anyone willing to work the land for 5 years. He would build a ranch, raise cattle, create something lasting that could be passed down to children not yet born. Eleanor had said yes because the alternative was working in a laundry for the rest of her life, breathing steam and lie growing old before her time. She had said yes because Thomas looked at her like she mattered, like she was more than just another Chinese girl in a city that barely tolerated their existence. She had said yes because sometimes you have to gamble everything on a dream, even when you know the odds are stacked against you. They had married in a simple ceremony in Chinatown, traveled east by train and wagon, filed their homestead claim, and built this cabin with their own hands. Thomas had worked like 3 men, clearing sagebrush, building fences, buying their first cattle with money borrowed at criminal interest rates, from the only man in Silver Pine willing to lend to a Chinese immigrant. They had struggled, but they had survived. Had even begun to prosper in small, careful ways. Then the drought came. 6 months without rain, the vegetable garden withering despite Eleanor's constant care, the grass turning brown, the creek running dry. Then the fever. 3 days of Thomas burning up with heat that no amount of cold water could quench. 3 days of him calling out in Cantonese for his mother for water, for relief that never came. 3 days of Eleanor holding his hand and praying to ways she was not sure she believed in anymore. On the 4th day, Thomas Chen died. 36 years old, dead in a foreign land, buried in ground so hard they had to use picks to break it, put to rest without the proper ceremonies, without incense or offerings, without any of the traditions that might have helped his spirit find peace. The town of Silver Pine had barely noticed. One less Chinese, one more vacant homestead that could be claimed by someone more deserving, someone white, someone American. The general store had stopped extending credit the day after the funeral. The neighbors who had been coolly polite when Thomas was alive became openly hostile toward his widow. Jobs that might have been offered to a desperate woman were mysteriously unavailable. Doors closed, opportunities vanished. The message was clear: leave. Go back to wherever you came from. You are not wanted here. But Eleanor had nowhere to go. San Francisco was 1,000 miles away and might as well have been on the moon. She had 3 children who needed stability, needed a home, needed something more than the charity of strangers who saw them as less than human. So she had stayed, had tried to make the homestead work with no knowledge of farming, no strength to clear land or mend fences, no money to buy the things they needed. She had sold the cattle one by one for whatever price she could get, knowing she was being cheated, but having no leverage to demand better terms. All that remained was the slow march toward an ending she could not prevent. Except James had brought a rabbit, one small miracle on the day Christians celebrated the birth of their Savior. Eleanor was not Christian, but she understood the symbolism. One small life given so that others might live. It would not save them, but it would buy them time. A few more days, a few more chances for something to change. She cleaned the rabbit with swift, efficient movements, wasting nothing, saving the bones for broth, the organs for David, who needed the iron, the pelt for lining Sarah's too thin shoes. The meat she cut into portions, calculating how to make it last longest, while still providing enough nutrition to keep them functioning. Tonight they would feast. Tomorrow they would return to starvation rations. But tonight, Christmas night, they would eat a meat and pretend that everything was going to be fine. While Eleanor worked, James sat at the table staring at nothing. David, 10 years old and quiet as a shadow, huddled near the stove, trying to absorb its meager heat. Sarah, 6 years old, with her mother's delicate features and her father's serious eyes, played with a corn-husk doll, moving it through elaborate scenarios only she understood. They did not ask about presents, did not mention Santa Claus or Christmas trees or any of the things the white children in town took for granted. They had learned not to want things they could never have. The morning passed slowly. Eleanor put the rabbit in a pot with water and the last handful of rice, a few wild onions she had found growing near the creek, a pinch of salt from the almost empty container. The smell that rose from the pot was intoxicating after so many weeks of nothing. David closed his eyes and breathed deep, his thin chest expanding. Sarah stopped playing with her doll and watched the pot like it might disappear if she looked away. Noon came and went. The stew simmered. Eleanor added a piece of fat she had been saving, watched it melt and swirl through the broth, adding richness they desperately needed. She tasted it, added more salt, tasted again. Not good, not by the standards of her mother's kitchen in Guangdong, but adequate. Enough. A meal that would fill their bellies and give them strength to face another day. She was ladling the stew into their 4 tin bowls when she heard it. The muffled crunch of hooves on snow. A wagon approaching from the east. Eleanor's hand froze. No one came out here. Not since Thomas died. Not since the town had made clear that the Chen family was to be shunned, avoided, forgotten. She moved to the window, wiping condensation from the glass with her sleeve. Through the frosted pane, she saw a wagon pulled by a massive draft horse, its breath pluming white in the frigid air. A single figure sat on the bench, bundled in a heavy buffalo coat, a hat pulled low against the cold. Eleanor's heart began to race. Who was this? What did they want? Had Mrs. Whitmore finally sent someone to force them off the land? Had the sheriff come to evict them for some invented crime? She looked at her children, saw the fear mirrored in their faces, and felt a fierce, protective rage well up inside her. Whatever came, she would not go quietly, would not surrender without a fight. The wagon halted in front of the cabin. The figure climbed down with the stiff movements of someone who had been riding in the cold for hours. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, moving with the careful economy of a man who lived alone and had learned to conserve energy. He did not knock, simply stood there, his presence commanding attention through the door. Eleanor's hand went to the knife she kept in her apron pocket. Not much of a weapon, but it was something. She moved to the door, her body blocking the children's view, her mind racing through possibilities. Then the man spoke. Morning. His voice was deep, roughened by disuse, the single word carrying across the frozen yard like a hammer strike. Open up. Need a hand. Eleanor hesitated. The voice was not threatening, not cold, just matter of fact, stating reality without embellishment. She cracked the door open, keeping her body in the gap, the knife hidden in the folds of her apron. The man looked at her from beneath the brim of his hat, blue eyes, weathered face, the kind of hard-worn features that come from years of outdoor work. Not old, maybe 44 or 45, but aged by sun and wind into something timeless. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze direct but not unkind. Mr. Hayes, Eleanor managed, her voice thin in the cold air. I do not understand. Arthur Hayes was already moving to the back of the wagon, pulling back a canvas tarp heavy with accumulated snow. Don't need you to understand. Just need you to help carry this in before it freezes solid. Eleanor stepped out onto the porch, the cold hitting her like a physical blow. She moved closer to the wagon, confused and wary, and then she saw what lay beneath the tarp. A side of smoked beef, easily 20 pounds, sacks of potatoes, a bag of white flour, rice, dried apples, a jar of molasses, salt, sugar, coffee, and tucked in the corner a small paper bag of hard red candies. Her vision blurred. The world swayed. This was not possible. Could not be real. She had to be hallucinating from hunger, conjuring impossible visions from desperate need. I cannot pay for this, she whispered, her accent thickening with fear and confusion. We have no money, Mr. Hayes. I have nothing to give you. Arthur lifted a heavy sack of potatoes onto his shoulder with casual strength. He looked at her, his blue eyes sharp under the brim of his hat. Did I ask for payment? But I do not. Had a good year, he said gruffly, cutting her off. Too much stock. Would have gone to waste. Your pride is your business, Mrs. Chen. But letting good food freeze while children go hungry, that is just foolishness. The cabin door creaked open behind Eleanor. James, David, and Sarah stood in the doorway, their eyes enormous, staring at the wagon like it was a dragon from the old stories come to life. Is that food? Sarah asked, her voice small and disbelieving. Eleanor looked at Arthur, this giant stranger who had driven through winter cold to save them, and felt something break inside her chest. Why? She asked, her voice cracking. Why would you do this for strangers? Arthur met her gaze. There was no pity in his face, only a steady, clear-eyed respect that Eleanor had not seen directed at her since Thomas died. Strangers are just neighbors you have not met yet. Help me carry or I do it myself. Either way, this food is coming in. Help him, Eleanor said, the command rushing out of her before she could think. James, David, help Mr. Hayes. The boys moved instantly, bursting out into the snow in their thin boots and threadbare coats. Arthur directed them with quiet authority, treating them not like children or nuisances, but like capable hands whose work mattered. He handed Sarah the bag of candies, and the look on her face was like watching the sun break through storm clouds. Arthur did not just drop the supplies and leave. He came inside, filling the small cabin with his size and a quiet, steady warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. He saw the low fire in the stove and immediately went back out, returning with armfuls of seasoned oak logs from the wagon. He built the fire until it roared, pushing back the cold that had claimed the room for so long Eleanor had forgotten what real warmth felt like. Water, he said to James. Big pot. Eleanor watched him, feeling like a guest in her own home. He moved with an efficiency that betrayed a life of self-reliance, unwrapping the beef, slicing off thick steaks with a knife he produced from his belt. I can cook, Eleanor stammered, stepping forward. Please sit. Arthur glanced at her. I'm sure you can, but I am already standing. He paused, something softening in his expression. We will do it together. And they did. For the first time in 8 months, the kitchen was alive with purpose. Eleanor washed rice, real rice, more than she had seen in a year, while Arthur showed David how to peel potatoes without wasting half the vegetable with the skin. The smell of searing meat and boiling rice filled the air, a scent so rich it made Eleanor dizzy with hunger, and hope intermingled. Coffee is ready, Arthur said, pouring a cup from the pot he had placed on the grate. He handed it to Eleanor. Drink, you look like you are about to fall over. Eleanor took the cup. It was real coffee, strong, and black, the first she had tasted in 6 months. The first sip brought tears she could no longer suppress. She sat at the table and Sarah climbed into her lap, clutching a piece of candy like it was made of diamonds. "Are we having a feast, Mama?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with wonder. Eleanor sobbed, kissing her daughter's head, unable to speak. Arthur continued cooking his broad back to them, giving them privacy for their emotions while he worked. James and David set the table with the tin plates and battered utensils, moving with a careful reverence, handling each item like it was precious porcelain. When the meal was ready, they sat. Arthur took the head of the table without being asked the position Thomas had once occupied, and Eleanor felt a pang of something complicated. Grief, gratitude, guilt at feeling gratitude. The emotions swirled through her too fast to parse. James sat stiffly, his eyes moving between his mother and this stranger who had invaded their lives with kindness more shocking than any cruelty. David fidgeted, unused to having food in front of him that he was actually allowed to eat. Sarah stared at Arthur with open curiosity, her child's mind trying to categorize this giant man who gave her candy and made her mother cry. They ate, the first real meal in 4 months. James began to cry halfway through his second helping, overwhelmed by the simple fact of a full stomach. David ate until he looked sick, his shrunken stomach unable to process the sudden abundance. Sarah fell asleep with a piece of beef still clutched in her small fist. Eleanor tried to eat slowly to savor it, but her body betrayed her, demanding more taking in fuel it desperately needed. Arthur ate quietly, watching them with eyes that saw too much. He said little, but when David started to tell a rambling story about a rabbit he had almost caught last week, Arthur listened with the same serious attention he might give to a business partner discussing important matters. When Sarah woke and asked him if he had a little girl, Arthur's face went still and distant. "Had a son once," he said after a long pause. "Long time ago." Sarah, with the brutal innocence of children, asked, "Where is he gone?" Arthur said simply, "But I remember him every day." Eleanor saw something in his eyes, then a grief that matched her own, and understood that this man knew loss, knew what it meant to have everything and lose it, knew the particular agony of an empty place at the table. After the meal, the cabin was warm and full of the comfortable heaviness that comes from satisfied hunger. Arthur stood, began to gather his things, preparing to leave. Outside, the wind had picked up, gusting hard enough to rattle the shutters. James moved to the window, looked out at the darkening sky. "Storm is coming," he said quietly. Arthur joined him at the window, studied the clouds rolling in from the northwest. "Big one. Be here in an hour." "You cannot travel in that," Eleanor said, moving to stand beside them. The sky had turned the color of old bruises, heavy with snow that would fall thick and blinding. "It is not safe." Arthur hesitated. Eleanor could see the calculation in his eyes, the impropriety of staying, the danger of leaving, the balance between scandal and survival. "Please stay," she said firmly. "You have saved our lives today. I will not have your death on my conscience." Arthur looked at her, really looked at her, and Eleanor forced herself not to look away. Let him see her determination. Let him understand that she meant what she said. "I will sleep by the fire," Arthur said finally, "with the door open between us. Your reputation matters." "My reputation died with my husband," Eleanor said quietly, "but I thank you for caring about it anyway." That night, Arthur sat in Thomas's old rocking chair while the children gathered around him. He did not know fairy tales, did not know the stories they had grown up with. So he told them about the high country, about wolves that hunted in coordinated packs intelligent as soldiers, about wild mustangs that could never be tamed, their spirits too fierce for any man's control, about the silence of the mountains that felt like church, vast and humbling and pure. Sarah fell asleep against his heavy boot. Arthur's large calloused hand came to rest gently on her head, a gesture so tender it made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. This hard man, this stranger, treating her daughter with a care that suggested he knew exactly how precious children were, how fragile, how easily lost. Eventually, Eleanor gathered the sleeping children and carried them up to the loft. "That must have cost." "Had some savings. Sold my father's watch for the rest." Eleanor gasped. "Your father's watch? But it was a thing. Things can be replaced. People cannot." His voice carried a weight of conviction that ended all discussion. The $8,000 he had saved over 15 years sat untouched in a strong box at the ranch. That money was for emergencies, for disasters, for the kind of catastrophic loss he had experienced once and feared experiencing again. He had not touched it for the Chen family because charity from savings felt like pity, but his father's watch sold for immediate need felt like sacrifice. There was a difference. Eleanor thought of the watch of what such an item must have meant to him, a connection to family, to the past, to everything that came before. And he had sold it. For strangers. For Chinese immigrants the town despised. For a family he owed nothing. "I do not know how to thank you," she whispered. "Do not need thanks. Need you to keep fighting. Keep your children alive. That is thanks enough." They sat in silence, then watching the fire burn down to coals, while outside the wind howled and snow began to fall in thick, heavy curtains. The storm had arrived just as Arthur predicted. By morning, the drifts would be 6 feet high in places. Travel would be impossible. Arthur would be trapped here for days. Eleanor knew what the town would say when they learned. A widow and a bachelor alone together for days with only children as chaperones. The scandal would be massive. The condemnation absolute. Her already tattered reputation would be shredded completely. But looking at this man who had given everything to save them, who sat in her dead husband's chair, with such careful respect for proprieties she no longer believed in, Eleanor found she did not care what anyone said. He had done what was right when everyone else had done what was easy. If the town could not see the difference, that was their failing, not his. "Mr. Hayes," she said quietly, "whatever happens, whatever people say, I want you to know. You are a good man, the best I have met in this country, and we are grateful." Arthur nodded, once his expression unreadable in the firelight. "Try to sleep, Mrs. Chen. Tomorrow we will see what the storm brings." But Eleanor lay awake in her small room, listening to the wind, hearing the steady breathing of the man in the next room, and wondered what it meant that for the first time in 8 months she felt safe. Felt like maybe possibly there was a future beyond tomorrow. Felt like a stranger's kindness had cracked open a door she thought was sealed forever. In the loft, James lay awake too, staring at the rough wood ceiling, thinking about the man downstairs. About the way he had treated them, not with pity, but with respect. About the casual strength in his movements, the quiet competence that needed no announcement. About the way he had looked at the rabbit James brought home and nodded, one man acknowledging another's success in the hunt. James thought about his father, about the gentle scholar who had never quite fit into this harsh land, who had dreamed of ranches but did not know how to build them, who had tried so hard to be American while remaining Chinese, never quite achieving either. And he thought about Arthur Hayes, who seemed to need no one's approval, who existed entirely on his own terms, who helped because it was right and damn what anyone thought. For the first time since his father died, James wondered if maybe possibly there was a way to be a man in this country, a way that did not require erasing who you were, a way that was about action, not apology. Arthur Hayes had shown him something tonight, though he could not yet name what it was. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, 4 people slept in warmth and safety they had not known in months. And when morning came, the world would be different. Not saved, not fixed, but changed in ways that mattered. Changed because one man had chosen kindness over indifference, had chosen action over the comfort of doing nothing. The wind howled, the snow fell, and in a small cabin on the edge of nowhere, hope flickered to life like a candle in the dark. Small, fragile, but burning. On the storm's second day, Arthur Hayes woke before dawn, his internal clock calibrated by 15 years of solitary ranching, refusing to acknowledge the luxury of sleeping late. The fire had burned down to embers during the night. He rose silently from his bedroll by the hearth, moving with the careful quiet of a man accustomed to not disturbing anyone because there was no one to disturb. The cabin was cold, but not desperately so. Arthur rebuilt the fire with practiced efficiency, adding kindling in a careful pyramid, blowing gently until flames caught and spread. He filled the kettle with snow, melted from the bucket by the door, and set it to boil. These small acts of maintenance, performed without thought or fanfare, were as natural to him as breathing. Eleanor emerged from her room as the first light touched the windows. She stopped when she saw the rebuilt fire, the water already heating this stranger who had taken over the fundamental tasks of keeping them alive. Arthur glanced up, nodded once, and returned his attention to the stove. "You did not need to do that," Eleanor said quietly. "Fire was low. Water needed heating." Arthur straightened his frame, seeming to fill the small space. Sleep well. Better than I have in months. Eleanor moved to the stove, her hands hovering near its warmth. The children. Still sleeping. Let them. Growing bodies need rest. Well, they stood in companionable silence, two people who had learned that words were often less useful than simply being present. Outside wind hammered against the cabin walls, driving snow horizontal across the white expanse of the world. The storm showed no signs of breaking. After a breakfast of coffee and leftover meat from the night before, Arthur began to inspect the cabin with the systematic thoroughness of a man who saw problems before they became disasters. Eleanor watched as he examined the door hinges, the window frames, the chinking between logs. His face revealed nothing, but she could see him cataloging deficiencies, calculating repairs. Door hinges rusted through, Arthur said, not looking at her. Window on the north side does not seal. Chimney has a crack that could spread. He paused. You have tools. Some. Thomas had a toolbox. I have not opened it since. Show me. Eleanor retrieved the wooden box from beneath her bed, its surface covered in a thin layer of dust. Arthur opened it, examined the contents with the quick assessment of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. Hammer, nails, a few screwdrivers, a wood plane that had seen better days. Basic but adequate. I can work with this, Arthur said. He looked at Eleanor directly. Your cabin needs repairs. I am here. Storm is not letting up. Makes sense to use the time. Mr. Hayes, you have already done so much. And I am telling you the door hinge will fail within a month if not fixed. When it does, your door will not close. In winter, that means freezing. So I fix it now or you freeze later. Your choice. Eleanor recognized the tone. It was not unkindness. It was practicality stripped of sentiment, the blunt assessment of a man who dealt in facts rather than feelings. She nodded. Arthur set to work. James, waking and coming down from the loft, watched for a moment before approaching. Can I help, sir? Arthur studied the boy, 14 years old, thin from hunger, but with good shoulders and steady hands. You know how to use a hammer. My father taught me some. Show me. Arthur handed James a nail and a scrap of wood. The boy positioned the nail, raised the hammer, brought it down. The strike was adequate but inefficient, the angle slightly wrong, too much wrist and not enough elbow. Again, Arthur said, but this time let the hammer do the work. You are trying to muscle it. Weight and gravity will drive the nail if you let them. Wrist loose, elbow acts as the hinge, shoulder provides the starting force. Try it. James adjusted his grip, his posture. The next strike was better. The third better still. Arthur nodded. Good. Now we are going to replace this hinge. Watch first. Then you do the other side. For the next hour, James received an education in practical carpentry. Arthur taught not with long explanations, but with demonstration and correction. He showed the boy how to remove old screws without stripping them, how to drill pilot holes to prevent wood from splitting, how to test the swing of a door to ensure proper alignment. James absorbed it all with intense concentration, asking occasional questions that Arthur answered with the same economical precision. David and Sarah watched from near the stove, Sarah playing with her corn husk doll, David simply observing with the quiet intensity of a child who learned by watching rather than doing. Eleanor prepared what would serve as their midday meal, stretching the supplies Arthur had brought with careful rationing that would make them last as long as possible. By afternoon, the door hung true on new hinges Arthur had fashioned from metal scraps in his wagon. That evening, as they sat around the table eating stew, made from the beef and vegetables Arthur had brought, the conversation drifted to the past. Sarah, emboldened by the comfort of a full belly and the presence of this gentle giant who had invaded their lives, asked Arthur about his ranch. How many cows do you have? She asked around a mouthful of potato. 200 head, 30 horses, some chickens. Arthur's voice held no pride, just statement of fact. That is a lot, David said quietly. It is enough, more than one man needs, but they need tending either way. Do you not get lonely? Eleanor asked, then immediately regretted the personal nature of the question. Arthur was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was measured, careful. Lonely is different from alone. Alone is a choice. Lonely is what happens when you realize you made the wrong choice and do not know how to unmake it. You could hire hands, James suggested, if the ranch is big enough. He said no, said it was too risky, that he might catch it himself, that no amount of money was worth that risk. The cabin was utterly silent except for the crackle of the fire and the endless howl of wind outside. Even Sarah had stopped eating, her child's instinct, sensing that something important was being said. Margaret died first, held her hand until the end. She asked me to take care of William, made me promise, then she was gone. Arthur's voice remained flat, emotionless, the words delivered like a medical report. William lasted 3 more days. He kept asking for his mother, kept saying he was scared. I told him she was waiting for him, that she would be there when he closed his eyes. He believed me. Children believe what their fathers tell them. I buried them both myself, in the rain. No preacher, no one to help lower the coffins, just me in the mud and the knowledge that I had failed them. That if I had been a better man, a richer man, a man who mattered, they would still be alive. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face. James stared at his plate, his jaw clenched tight. David had gone pale. Even Sarah seemed to understand that something terrible had been spoken aloud. You did not fail them, Eleanor said quietly. The world failed them. The town, the doctor, the system that values money over human life. But not you. You stayed. You held them. You were there. That is not failure. Arthur looked at her, and for the first time since arriving, she saw something crack in his armor. Not much, just a hairline fracture, but enough to glimpse the human being beneath the stone exterior. Tell yourself that enough times, maybe you start to believe it, he said. Been 15 years, still waiting for that day. The conversation moved to lighter topics after that, but something had shifted. Arthur had shared his wound, had let them see the scar tissue that covered but did not heal the fundamental damage, and in doing so had given Eleanor permission to acknowledge her own grief without shame. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Eleanor and Arthur sat by the fire again. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cabin was warm and secure, fortified by Arthur's repairs and provisioned by his sacrifice. Tomorrow the storm should break, Arthur said, studying the coals. I should be able to get back to my ranch. Animals need tending. Of course, Eleanor felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. 3 days, that was all it had been. 3 days of having another adult present, someone competent and capable, someone who shouldered burdens without being asked. 3 days of not being alone, and now it was ending. Before I go, need to teach James something important, if you permit. What is that? How to shoot properly. He has a rifle, has 1 bullet. That is not enough. I brought ammunition, want to show him how to use it, how to hunt effectively, how to protect his family if needed. Eleanor's first instinct was to refuse. Guns meant violence, meant danger, meant things she wanted to keep her children away from. But she looked around the cabin at the repairs Arthur had made, at the food he had brought, and understood that sentiment was a luxury they could not afford. James needed to know how to survive in this country, and survival meant knowing how to use a weapon. Yes, she said, teach him. Arthur nodded, satisfied. They sat in silence for a while longer, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Eleanor spoke. Mr. Hayes, may I ask you something personal? You can ask, cannot promise I will answer. Why did you never remarry? 15 years is a long time to be alone. Arthur considered the question. Tried once, about 5 years after Margaret died. Met a woman in Cheyenne, widow like me. We understood each other, or thought we did. Started courting. Got as far as discussing marriage. What happened? Realized I was trying to replace what I lost instead of building something new. Was not fair to her. Was not fair to Margaret's memory. Ended it. He paused. Some people are meant for one great love. Maybe I am one of those people. Or maybe I am just a coward who would rather be alone than risk that kind of pain again. I do not think you are a coward. Cowards do not drive into blizzards to save strangers. Different kind of courage. Easy to be brave when you have nothing left to lose. Hard to be brave when you might lose everything again. Eleanor thought about Thomas, about the love they had shared, that was comfortable rather than passionate, built on mutual respect and shared goals rather than fire and romance. She thought about what it would mean to love again, to open herself to that vulnerability, to risk the devastation she felt when he died. I understand, she said quietly. I think I understand completely. The third morning dawned clear and brutally cold. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a world transformed. Snow lay in drifts that reached the cabin's eaves in places sculpted by wind into fantastic shapes that glittered under a sun so bright it hurt to look at. The sky was the deep, flawless blue that only comes after major storms, empty of clouds promising frigid temperatures that would last for days. Arthur stood outside with James, both bundled against the cold. Arthur had brought his Winchester rifle, the same model as the one Thomas had left behind, but better maintained, its action smooth and reliable. He handed James a box of .22 caliber ammunition. 50 rounds, Arthur said. More than enough to learn proper technique and still have plenty for hunting. First rule of firearms. What is it? Always treat the gun like it is loaded, James recited, remembering his father's lessons. Good. Second rule, never point it at anything you do not want to destroy. Third, keep your finger off the trigger until you are ready to shoot. Arthur nodded, satisfied. Your father taught you well. Now I am going to teach you to shoot well. There is a difference. Set up those cans on the fence post, 50 yards. For the next 2 hours, James received intensive instruction in marksmanship. Arthur taught him about sight alignment, about breath control, about the squeeze rather than the pull. He taught him to read wind by watching snow blow across the field. He taught him to account for distance, to understand bullet drop, to make each shot count, because ammunition cost money and money was scarce. James fired 20 rounds that morning. The first 10 went wide, striking snow instead of targets. But with each miss, Arthur made small corrections. Adjust your stance. Relax your shoulders. Do not anticipate the recoil. Let the rifle surprise you. And gradually, incrementally, James's accuracy improved. When the boy finally hit a can dead center at 50 yards, Arthur did not congratulate him. Just nodded once and said, again. By the time they came back inside, James's hands were numb from cold, but his eyes were bright with accomplishment. He had hit 6 cans out of the last 10 shots. Not perfect, but adequate. Enough to bring home meat when the family needed it. Eleanor had coffee and food waiting. Arthur ate quickly, efficiently, already preparing mentally for departure. He would need to dig out the wagon harness, Ranger navigate drifts that might be impassable. It would be slow going, might take 6 hours to cover the 5 miles home. As Arthur prepared to leave, Eleanor walked him outside. The children stood in the doorway watching. Sarah held the bag of candies, half empty now, but still treasured. David stood with James, the 2 boys, side by side, already looking more substantial than they had 3 days ago. Good food and safety had begun the slow work of restoration. Mr. Hayes, Eleanor said, her breath frosting in the air between them. I do not know how to thank you for everything you have done. Told you, do not need thanks. But I need to give them. She pulled a small cloth bundle from her apron pocket. This is not much, just herbs, for when you are injured or sick. There is comfrey for wounds, willow bark for pain, ginger for nausea. My mother taught me about healing. It is the only valuable thing I have to offer. Arthur took the bundle, turned it over in his large hands. This is valuable, he said quietly. More than you know, thank you. They stood looking at each other, this widow and this hermit, 2 people damaged by loss and hardened by survival. Between them hung the question neither quite dared to ask. What happens now? Do we return to being strangers? Do we pretend these 3 days never happened? Or has something changed that cannot be unchanged? Will you come back, James asked suddenly from the doorway, to check on the repairs, to make sure we are doing it right? Arthur looked at the boy, saw the hope in his face, the hunger for male guidance that went deeper than physical hunger. He looked at Eleanor, saw her carefully neutral expression that did not quite hide her own hope. Next Sunday, Arthur said. I will come next Sunday. Bring more ammunition. Continue the lessons. The smile that broke across James's face was like sunrise. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. She blinked away quickly. Even David and Sarah seemed to stand straighter, energized by the promise of continuity, of not being abandoned after all. Arthur climbed onto his wagon, settled himself on the bench, and took up the reins. Ranger snorted his breath, pluming white, ready to work. Arthur looked back one more time at the cabin, at the family standing in the doorway, and something in his chest that had been frozen for 15 years shifted slightly. Not melting? Not yet, but no longer quite so solid. The journey back to his ranch took 8 hours. Drifts blocked the road in multiple places, requiring Arthur to dismount and shovel to lead Ranger through passages barely wide enough for the wagon. By the time he reached home, darkness had fallen and he was exhausted in ways that went beyond physical tiredness. But he had kept his word. The family was provisioned. The cabin was repaired. James had ammunition and knowledge. They would survive the winter, maybe longer. And Arthur Hayes had done something meaningful for the first time in 15 years. He unhitched Ranger, rubbed down the horse with handfuls of straw, gave him extra grain for the hard work. Then he went into his house, empty and cold, and exactly as he had left it, and felt the loneliness hit him like a physical blow. 3 days away. 3 days of voices and presence and mattering to someone. And now the silence pressed in like a living thing, suffocating in its completeness. Arthur built a fire, made coffee, ate cold beef standing at the counter. He should sleep, should rest, but his mind would not quiet. He kept seeing Eleanor's face when she realized what he had brought. James's concentration as he learned to shoot. Sarah's wonder at the simple gift of candy. David's quiet presence, always watching, always learning. He had thought himself content with isolation, had convinced himself that solitude was preference rather than punishment. But 3 days had shown him the lie he had been telling himself for 15 years. He was not content, he was hiding. And hiding, he was beginning to understand, was just another form of dying. The next days passed in familiar routine. Arthur tended his cattle, repaired fences damaged by the storm, checked on the horses in their pasture. The work was endless and demanding, requiring every hour of daylight and some from darkness besides. But now, as he worked, his mind drifted to the cabin 5 miles west, wondering how they were managing, if the repairs were holding, if James was practicing his shooting. Sunday came. Arthur woke early, did his morning chores, then bathed and shaved with more care than he had shown in months. He selected his cleanest shirt, his best coat, and told himself it had nothing to do with Eleanor Chen, that basic hygiene was simply appropriate when visiting neighbors. The lie felt thin even to him. He arrived at the cabin at mid-morning, carrying a burlap sack with 2 freshly killed rabbits and more ammunition for James. The children ran out to greet him, Sarah launching herself at his legs in a hug that nearly knocked him over. The sheer enthusiasm of their welcome surprised him, touched something he thought had calcified beyond feeling. Eleanor stood in the doorway, and Arthur noticed that she too had made an effort. Her hair was braided and pinned, her dress mended where it had been torn, her face holding an expression that might have been happiness if she remembered exactly what happiness looked like. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "you came. Said I would. I keep my word. I'm learning that about you." They spent the day in companionable activity. Arthur worked with James on shooting technique, setting up targets at varying distances, teaching the boy to estimate range by eye. Eleanor prepared food while David read aloud from one of the few books they owned, his voice gaining confidence as he went. Sarah followed Arthur around like a shadow when he was not actively teaching James, chattering about everything and nothing, filling the air with words simply because she could. At some point during the afternoon, as Arthur sat on the porch step watching James line up a shot, Eleanor came and sat beside him. They said nothing for a long time, just sat in shared silence while James fired and reloaded and fired again. "He is becoming good at this," Eleanor observed. "He has the temperament for it. Patient, careful, does not rush. You are a good teacher." "I am adequate. The boy does the real work." Eleanor smiled slightly. "You do not take compliments well." "Never had much practice." More silence. James hit the target 3 times in succession. Arthur nodded approval. The boy beamed. "Mr. Hayes, I want to ask you something," Eleanor said, carefully. "But I fear it is too much to ask. Only one way to find out. The children and I, we go to church on Sundays. We have not gone since Thomas died because the town made clear we were not welcome. But today I think I would like to go, to give thanks for our continued survival, for your help. Would you consider coming with us?" Arthur's face went carefully neutral. "Mrs. Chen, you understand what that would mean, the town seeing us together, the talk it would generate." "I understand, but I am tired of hiding, tired of being ashamed of being alive. If they want to talk, let them talk. I am done caring." Arthur studied her face, saw the determination there, the steel beneath the soft exterior. This was not a woman asking for protection. This was a woman declaring her independence and inviting him to stand beside her as an equal. "All right," he said. We go together. The walk to Silver Pine took an hour through snow that had begun to melt in patches, leaving the road a mix of ice and mud that made footing treacherous. They walked in a loose group, Arthur in front, breaking trail, Eleanor and the children following in his wake. The town came into view slowly, a collection of wooden buildings huddled against the cold smoke rising from dozens of chimneys. When they reached the church, a simple wooden structure with a steeple that listed slightly to the left, people were already gathering outside. The conversation stopped the moment Arthur and Eleanor came into view. Faces turned, eyes widened, whispers began. Arthur felt Eleanor hesitate beside him. He looked down at her, saw the fear fighting with determination in her eyes. "We can leave," he said quietly. "Say the word and we go." Eleanor lifted her chin. "We stay." They walked through the crowd, which parted before them like water around stone. The silence was total and oppressive. Mrs. Thompson, who had once bought eggs from Eleanor, turned her back entirely. Mr. Patterson, who ran the general store, made the sign of the cross as if warding off evil. A group of children pointed and giggled until their mothers shushed them harshly. Inside the church, the hostility became even more palpable. Every pew seemed suddenly full. No room for the Chinese widow and her strange companion. Arthur led them to a bench near the front, empty, because no one wanted to sit so close to the pulpit. They sat. Behind them, people shifted, moved backward, creating distance, as if poverty and foreignness might be contagious. Reverend Samuel Cole entered from the side door and froze when he saw them. His eyes met Arthur's and something complicated passed between them. Recognition, memory, debt. The Reverend's face went pale, then flushed, then pale again. He climbed to the pulpit like a man walking to his execution. The service began. Hymns were sung with pointed looks thrown toward the front pew. Prayers were offered with emphasis on words like righteousness, impropriety, and moral conduct. Eleanor sat with her back straight, her hands folded, her face composed. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her discomfort. Then came the sermon. Reverend Cole opened his Bible, found the passage he had marked, the one he had prepared about maintaining community standards and avoiding scandal. His hand trembled slightly. He looked out at his congregation, saw Mrs. Harriet Whitmore in the third row, her face hard with expectation, waiting for him to condemn the woman and the hermit who dared disturb their righteous order. In the third row, Tom Whitmore, 15 years old and caught between his mother's expectations and his own conscience, sat with his head bowed. He had seen what his mother's hired men tried to do, had heard the plans, and said nothing. The weight of that silence pressed on him like stones. He looked at Arthur Hayes, the man who had saved his life 10 years ago, when 3 road agents had left him for dead, the man who had never asked for acknowledgement or thanks, who had simply done what was right and then disappeared back into his self-imposed exile. Reverend Cole closed the Bible, opened it to a different page, and began to speak. "Today I want to talk about the Good Samaritan," he said, his voice gaining strength as he committed to his choice. "There was a man traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho who fell among thieves. They beat him, robbed him, and left him half dead by the roadside." The congregation shifted uncomfortably. This was not the sermon they had been promised. A priest came along and saw the wounded man. And what did the priest do? He passed by on the other side. Then came a Levite, also passed by. But then came a Samaritan, a man despised by the society of that time, considered unclean, unwelcome, less than human. And what did this Samaritan do? Reverend Cole's voice rang through the church. He stopped. He bound the man's wounds. He took him to an inn and paid for his care. He showed mercy when the righteous showed indifference. Mrs. Whitmore stood abruptly. "Reverend Cole, this is not the sermon we discussed." "Sit down, Mrs. Whitmore." Oh, the shock of being contradicted in public made her hesitate. "I will not." "You will sit or you will leave. But you will not interrupt the word of God." Mrs. Whitmore sat, her face contorted with rage. The congregation buzzed with whispered shock. Reverend Cole had never in 15 years of ministry spoken to the town's leading benefactor with anything but deference. He continued, "There is a widow in our town. Her husband died. She was left with 3 children and no means to support them. They were starving, freezing, dying by inches. And what did we do? We who call ourselves Christians, we raised our prices. We refused them credit. We turned our backs. We were the priest. We were the Levite. We passed by. The church was utterly silent now. Even the children had stopped fidgeting. But one man, a man we call hermit, and strange a man who keeps to himself and asks nothing of anyone, this man saw their need and acted. He brought food. He made repairs. He saved lives. And what do? We judge him. We whisper. We condemn. We become the very thing we claim to oppose. Reverend Cole looked directly at Mrs. Whitmore. Which of us is righteous, the man who helps or the people who judge him for it? He closed the Bible with a decisive thump. Service is ended. Go in peace or do not, but examine your consciences before you examine your neighbors. The congregation sat stunned. Then Mrs. Whitmore rose, gathered her skirts, and walked out, her footsteps echoing in the silence. 10 others followed her, a show of solidarity with wealth and power. But 90 remained frozen in their pews, forced to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. After the service, people avoided Eleanor and Arthur, but with less hostility than before. More confusion, as if the script they had been following had suddenly changed and no one knew their new lines. A few nodded hesitantly. No one spoke. Except Jacob Miller, the town blacksmith, a man in his 50s with arms like tree trunks and a reputation for fairness. He approached Arthur directly, hand extended. Hayes, that took guts. Arthur shook his hand. Did not do it for recognition. I know, that is why it matters. Miller turned to Eleanor. Ma'am, if you need anything, you come to my smithy. Credit is good with me. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Thank you. As they walked back to the cabin, James walked close to Arthur's side. Mr. Hayes, will Reverend Cole get in trouble? Probably. Because of us. Because he chose principle over comfort. That always has a cost. Was it wrong for us to go? Arthur stopped walking, turned to face the boy. Listen to me, James. People will always tell you what you should do, where you should go, how you should act. Most of those people are more concerned with their comfort than your welfare. You have to decide what you believe is right and then do it regardless of what others think. Your father understood that. He brought your family here knowing it would be hard, knowing people would judge. But he did it anyway because he believed in building something better. Do not dishonor his memory by living small because others are afraid. James nodded slowly, absorbing the lesson. They walked on. That evening, as Arthur prepared to leave, he found Eleanor waiting by his wagon. The children were inside, visible through the window, but giving them privacy. You will come again next Sunday, Eleanor asked. If you want me to. I do. The children do. She paused, searching for words. You have become important to us, Mr. Hayes, more than just help, something more. Arthur understood what she was not quite saying, that in 3 Sundays he had become woven into the fabric of their lives in ways that exceeded simple charity, that his presence mattered, that his absence would be felt. I will come, he said, every Sunday, for as long as you will have me. Eleanor smiled, a real smile that transformed her face from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. Arthur felt something shift in his chest, a movement of ice that had been solid for so long, he had forgotten it was ice and not stone. He climbed onto his wagon and drove away into the gathering darkness. But this time the loneliness of his ranch felt less like home and more like a place he endured between visits to the cabin, where life happened, where he was needed, where he was becoming something more than the ghost he had been. Behind him, Eleanor stood watching until the wagon disappeared into the night. Then she went inside, gathered her children, and for the first time in 8 months felt something like hope for the future. But 5 miles away in the largest house in Silver Pine, Mrs. Harriet Whitmore sat at her desk writing notes with sharp, angry strokes of her pen. Notes to the church board about Reverend Cole's inappropriate sermon. Notes to business owners suggesting they might want to reconsider their associations. Notes that would set in motion consequences she had no intention of allowing anyone to avoid. Arthur Hayes had made an enemy, and Eleanor Chen, already despised, had become a target for more focused persecution. The town had tolerated their existence before. Now it would actively work to remove them. The war had begun. Neither side knew it yet, but the first shots had been fired in a church on a cold Sunday morning, and the conflict that followed would test every assumption about justice community and what it meant to choose right over easy. The ambush came on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after the church incident. Arthur Hayes rode through the pine forest that separated his ranch from Eleanor's cabin, Ranger's hooves crunching through snow that had frozen hard overnight. He had promised to deliver more firewood to check on repairs he had made to the chimney to continue James's shooting lessons. Simple promises, the kind a neighbor makes. Except Arthur was beginning to understand that what he felt went far beyond neighborly concern. The bullet came without warning. One moment Arthur was riding through dappled sunlight filtering through pine branches. The next his hat flew off his head, a neat hole punched through the crown. The crack of the rifle shot echoed a split second later. Arthur threw himself sideways off Ranger, hit the snow hard, rolled behind a fallen log, and his two more shots kicked up ice where he had been. Ranger bolted, terrified, disappearing into the trees. Arthur lay still, breathing hard, his Colt .45 already in his hand. 3 shooters minimum, judging by the spacing of the shots. Positioned in a rough triangle around the trail. Professional ambush. They had been waiting for him. Hayes. A voice called from the trees to his right. Billy Crane. Arthur recognized the cocky drawl. You hear me, Hayes? Arthur said nothing. Silence was a weapon. Let them wonder if they had hit him. Let them make mistakes born of uncertainty. We know you are alive, Billy shouted. Saw you dive. Smart move, but it just delays things. Another voice from the left this time. Frank Stone. Mr. Hayes, this does not have to go bad. Just ride away from the Chen woman. Leave her be. You do that, we let you go home safe. Arthur's jaw clenched. So that was it. Mrs. Whitmore had sent her dogs. He scanned the tree line, looking for movement, counting positions. Billy right, maybe 40 yards. Frank left 50 yards. A third man behind, probably 60 yards up on higher ground. Classic crossfire setup. They had military training or had at least thought this through. What is it going to be, Hayes? Billy called. Your life or a Chinese widow who will be dead in a month anyway. Arthur's finger tightened on the trigger. He could take Billy. One good shot. But the moment he fired, Frank and the third man would triangulate his position, pour fire into his cover. The log would not stop rifle bullets for long. He had 6 rounds in the Colt. They had rifles with better range and more ammunition. Bad odds, but Arthur Hayes had survived 15 years alone in hard country by being harder than anything trying to kill him. He did not plan to stop now. Movement, Billy shifting position, overconfident, thinking Arthur was pinned. Mistake. Arthur aimed at the shadow, fired twice. The first shot clipped a branch. The second caught Billy in the shoulder, spinning him around. The scream that followed was satisfying. Return fire erupted from 2 positions. Bullets tore through the log, spraying Arthur with splinters. He rolled left, came up behind a boulder, fired once at Frank's position. Hit or miss, he could not tell, but Frank stopped shooting. Son of a bitch shot me, Billy wailed from the trees. Shut up. That was the third voice. Older. Calmer. Joe Baker, Arthur guessed, one of Mrs. Whitmore's ranch hands. Frank, you hit? No, but he has got us pinned down as much as we got him on my own. Then rush him together. I will give cover fire. Arthur's mind raced. If they coordinated an assault, even wounded as Billy was 3 against 1 would overwhelm him. He needed to break the attack, make them reconsider. He needed to be somewhere they did not expect. He moved fast, low, and quiet, circling left through the trees. Years of hunting had taught him how to move through forest without sound. He covered 30 yards in near silence, coming up on Frank's flank. Frank was focused forward, a rifle aimed at where Arthur had been. Never saw the threat from the side. Arthur stepped out of cover, Colt leveled. Drop it. Frank froze. Slowly, he let the rifle fall into the snow. Billy Joe, he has got me. Frank's voice cracked with fear. Then you are on your own, Joe calls back, the sound of rapid movement. Retreating. Joe was cutting his losses, leaving his companions. Billy crashed through the underbrush, supporting his wounded shoulder, moving in panicked flight. Arthur let him go. Let them both go. He was not here to kill, just to make clear the cost of trying to kill him. He picked up Frank's rifle, worked the action to empty the chamber, then smashed the stock against a tree, breaking it at the receiver. Ruined. He tossed it back to Frank. Tell Mrs. Whitmore this was her warning shot. Next time people die. You understand me? Frank nodded frantically. Now get out of my sight. Frank ran. Arthur stood alone in the forest, adrenaline still singing through his veins. They had tried to kill him, would have succeeded against a lesser man. and they would try again, he had no doubt. Mrs. Whitmore was not the type to accept defeat, which meant Eleanor was in danger. If they could not remove Arthur, they would go after her directly, remove the problem at its source. Arthur found Ranger a quarter-mile away, calmed the frightened horse, and rode hard for Eleanor's cabin. He needed to see that she was safe, needed to warn her, needed to do something his rational mind told him was foolish, but his heart demanded anyway. The cabin came into view, smoke rising from the chimney. Normal, peaceful. Arthur dismounted, his hand still on his pistol, eyes scanning for threats. Nothing. The door opened. Eleanor emerged, saw his face, and went pale. What happened? Ambush, 3 men, Mrs. Whitmore's people. Arthur kept his voice level, factual, but he could see Eleanor processing the implications. You are hurt. No, but they will come here next. Cannot take me, they will take you. Force me to back off or force you to leave. Either way, they win. Eleanor's hands clenched into fists. I will not leave. This is my home, my land. I know, which is why we need to talk. Inside. They sat at the table, the children banished to the loft, listening to the adults discuss things they were too young to hear, but old enough to understand were serious. Arthur laid out the situation with brutal honesty. Mrs. Whitmore wanted the land. She had resources, connections, and no moral restraints. She would use legal means, if possible, violence if necessary. Why, Eleanor asked. Why does she want this worthless piece of frozen ground so badly? Arthur hesitated, then reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. A map, crude but detailed with notations in Thomas Chen's handwriting. Found this in your husband's papers when I was fixing the floorboards last week. Did not mention it because I was not sure it was real. But after today, after seeing how desperate Whitmore is, I think it might be. Eleanor unfolded the map. Her breath caught. Silver vein, Northridge, 200 yards from cabin. She looked up at Arthur. Thomas found silver. Suspected it, never confirmed. But if he was right, and if Mrs. Whitmore knows or suspects, that explains everything. Silver claim on homestead land properly filed could be worth $50,000. Maybe more. Your husband came to town 2 months before he died, asking the assayer about silver ore testing. Word got around. Mrs. Whitmore has eyes and ears everywhere. She put 2 and 2 together. But we have no money to mine it. No equipment. No knowledge. No, but Mrs. Whitmore does. She waits for you to starve or flee, files claim on abandoned land, extracts, the silver becomes even richer than she already is. Clean, legal, profitable. Eleanor stared at the map, this piece of paper that transformed their worthless homestead into something worth killing for. What do we do? Arthur leaned back. We verify it. If there is silver, we file proper claim, make it public record. Then it becomes harder to steal. Still possible, but harder. If there is no silver, we know Mrs. Whitmore is just vindictive, and we deal with that differently. And if there is silver, how do we mine it? That is a different problem, but one thing at a time. They spent the afternoon investigating the North Ridge. Arthur brought tools, his eye for geology honed by years of working land. They followed Thomas's map to a rocky outcropping 200 yards from the cabin, partially hidden by scrub pine and snowdrift. Arthur chipped at the exposed rock face with a prospector's hammer. The first few strikes revealed nothing. Then 10 inches and a glint of something that was not granite. He widened the opening, exposing a vein of ore that ran back into the hillside. Not pure silver, but argentiferous galena silver-bearing lead ore. Good quality. Potentially very good quality. How much, Eleanor asked. Would need an assayer to say for certain, but based on the vein width and what I can see, if it runs deep, you are looking at somewhere between $50,000 and $200,000. Eleanor sat down hard in the snow. We are standing on a fortune. You are standing on a fortune. This is your land, your claim. Thomas's claim, I am just the widow. Law does not care. Homestead is in both names per the filing. You inherit his half. You already owned your half. It is yours. Arthur paused. But owning it and keeping it are different things. Mrs. Whitmore will not stop. She will escalate legal challenges, violence, pressure on anyone who might help you. You need allies, resources, and luck. Lots of luck. Eleanor looked at the exposed vein at the promise of wealth beyond anything she had imagined and felt only exhaustion. I do not want to fight. I just want to raise my children in peace. I know, but peace is not what life is offering right now. So you fight or you run. Those are your choices. What would you do? Arthur met her eyes. I would fight, but I lost my family because I did not have resources to save them. I swore I would never be helpless again. So I built my ranch, made myself self-sufficient, made myself into someone who could not be pushed around. If you want to stay, you become that person too. You fight smart, fight hard, and you make them regret coming after you. Eleanor thought of Thomas, gentle Thomas, who had never wanted conflict, who had believed hard work and good intentions would be enough. She thought of her children growing up in a world that judged them by their skin and their accent before considering their character. She thought of 8 months of slow starvation while the town watched with indifference or satisfaction. Teach me to fight, she said. Arthur nodded once. First lesson, we fortify this cabin, make it defensible, because they will come. And when they do, we need to be ready. Over the next 3 days, Arthur transformed the cabin into a strong point. He reinforced the door with crossbeams that could be dropped into brackets, turning it into a barrier that would require axes to breach. He created firing ports in the shutters, small gaps that allowed defenders to shoot out while remaining protected. He stockpiled firewood inside enough for a week, eliminating the need to go outside in a siege. He showed James and Eleanor how to reload rifles efficiently, how to shoot from cover, how to think tactically about defending space. James absorbed it all with fierce concentration. At 14, he was becoming something harder than a boy, something forged by necessity, into a young man who understood that survival was earned, not granted. Arthur watched the transformation and felt both pride and sadness. Pride at the competence emerging, sadness that it was necessary. On the 4th day, the attack came. It was pre-dawn, that dead hour when humans sleep deepest and vigilance flags. Arthur, sleeping by the fire as he had been for the past 3 nights, came instantly awake at a sound that did not belong. A horse's whinny, cut off too quickly. Someone had silenced an animal to maintain surprise. He was on his feet, pistol in hand, moving to the shuttered window. Opened the firing port a crack. 5 shapes moving through the pre-dawn gloom. Billy Crane, arm in a sling but mobile. Frank Stone, Joe Baker, and 2 men Arthur did not recognize. Mercenaries, probably. Mrs. Whitmore had hired professionals. They carried torches and weapons. Their intent was clear. Burn the cabin, drive the occupants out, deal with them in the chaos. Simple, brutal, effective if the targets were unprepared. But Arthur was always prepared. He moved to the loft ladder. James, wake up, quietly. The boy's eyes opened, immediately alert. Good. Arthur had trained that into him over the past weeks. How many? James whispered. 5. Coming to burn us out. Get your rifle. North window. Do not fire until I do. James moved silently, waking David and Sarah, getting them into the back room where Eleanor slept. Arthur heard Eleanor's sharp intake of breath, then her moving dressing, preparing. No hysteria, no panic. She had listened when Arthur explained what to do if this happened. The attackers were at 40 yards now, spread in a loose line, torches bright in the darkness. Arthur could see Billy gesturing, explaining the plan. Rush the cabin, throw torches on the roof, wait for them to run out. Simple. They advanced, 30 yards, 20. Arthur opened the shutter fully and fired. The shot took Billy in the leg, dropping him with a scream that shattered the pre-dawn quiet. The other 4 scattered, diving for cover, torches dropped and sputtering in the snow. Fire on the cabin, Joe Baker shouted. Gunfire erupted. Bullets slammed into the shutters, the reinforced door, the log walls. But Arthur had chosen his firing position well. Solid logs, good angles. The bullets damaged but did not penetrate. James fired from the north window. Missed but close enough that Frank Stone yelped and rolled behind a tree. There is 2 of them, Frank shouted. 3, Eleanor called out, her voice hard. She fired from the east window, the rifle Arthur had given her bucking against her shoulder. She missed by a wider margin than James, but her presence was noted. The woman is armed. Then shoot the woman. That was one of the mercenaries, voice cold and professional. Concentrated fire hit the east window. Eleanor ducked back just as bullets tore through the shutter. She fell and Arthur's heart stopped, until he saw her rising unharmed, just startled. "You all right?" he called. "Yes, I am fine." The firing slackened. The attackers were reassessing. 5 against 3, but the three were fortified, armed, and competent. Not the easy target they had expected. "Hayes," Joe Baker called out, "this does not have to go bad. Just let us talk to Mrs. Chen." "Talk with rifles," Arthur shouted back. "That is not talking. We just want the land. She can go free, take her kids. We will even give her money for supplies. She does not have to die." Arthur looked at Eleanor. She shook her head firmly. Her land, her home, not for sale. "No deal," Arthur shouted. Silence. "Then have it your way." One of the mercenaries, braver or stupider than the others, made a run at the cabin, firing his pistol as he came. Arthur shot him twice. The man went down hard and did not move. The sudden violence shocked the others into stillness. "You killed him!" Frank's voice was high with fear. "You attacked a family's home in the night," Arthur roared back. "What did you think would happen? We would surrender, beg for mercy. You came to burn us alive. So yes, I killed him, and I will kill every one of you if you do not leave right now." Another silence, longer this time. The remaining attackers were having a conversation Arthur could not hear. Billy was crying, his leg wounds serious. Frank sounded panicked. The remaining mercenary was calculating odds. Joe Baker was trying to hold it together, knowing Mrs. Whitmore would be furious if they came back with nothing. Then Arthur heard it. Hoofbeats, multiple horses, coming fast from the direction of town. "Company coming," James called from his window. Arthur's mind raced. Reinforcements for the attackers. Or something else. The riders burst into view. 7 men, led by Jacob Miller the blacksmith. Behind him, Reverend Cole and 5 others Arthur recognized from church. Town men, armed but not threatening. "What in the name of God is happening here?" Miller's voice boomed across the clearing. Joe Baker stepped out from cover, trying to sound authoritative. "This is private business, Miller. Not your concern. Gunfire before dawn is everyone's concern, especially when it involves a woman and children. Mrs. Whitmore hired us to—" "I do not care what Mrs. Whitmore hired you to do. I am here to see that this stops before someone else dies." Miller looked at the body of the mercenary in the snow. "Too late for that, I see." "He attacked my home," Arthur called from the cabin. "I defended it. That is legal." "It is wishes," Miller agreed. He looked at Joe Baker. "You and your men need to leave now, before this turns into a massacre that gets every one of you hanged. Mrs. Whitmore can take her grievances to the sheriff in the courts like a civilized person. What she cannot do is hire killers to burn out widows in the night. That stops now." Joe Baker looked at his wounded companions, at the dead mercenary, at the 7 armed men who had just appeared to even the odds. He made the smart choice. "We are leaving, but this is not over. It better be, because next time you will be facing more than 7 of us. Word has spread about what you people tried at the church, about how you treat the Chen family. Town is changing its mind about who the good people are in this situation. You keep pushing, you will find out just how much it has changed." The attackers withdrew, helping Billy limp away, leaving the dead mercenary in the snow. Miller and his men waited until they were out of sight before approaching the cabin. Arthur opened the door cautiously. Miller stood there, big and solid and completely serious. "You folks all right?" "We are alive, thanks to you." Miller shrugged. "Reverend Cole woke me up an hour ago. Said he had a bad feeling. Sometimes you listen to feelings like that. Gathered some men who were willing. Guess we timed it right." Reverend Cole stepped forward. "Mr. Hayes, Mrs. Chen, I owe you an apology. I should have stood against Mrs. Whitmore years ago. Should have spoken up when your husband died. Mrs. Chen and the town turned its back. I was a coward. I chose my position over my principles. But seeing what happened at church, seeing this tonight, I am done being a coward." "You risked everything speaking up in church," Eleanor said. "That was not cowardice. It was years too late, but maybe not too late to matter." Reverend Cole looked at the cabin, the bullet holes, the marks of battle. "This cannot continue. Mrs. Whitmore has gone too far. We need to bring this to the law." "The sheriff is in her pocket," Arthur said flatly. "Then we go over his head. Territorial marshal, newspapers. Make enough noise that it becomes impossible to ignore." Miller crossed his arms. "Whitmore thinks she owns this town because she has money. Time to remind her that towns are made of people, not dollars. They talked for another hour, making plans, coordinating responses. By the time Miller and his men left, the sun had risen, fully revealing a world transformed, not by snow or storm, but by the simple fact that the Chen family was no longer alone. They had allies, maybe not many, maybe not powerful, but enough to shift the balance. After the men left, Arthur helped Eleanor board up the damaged shutters. James and David carried the dead mercenary into the barn, covering him with a tarp until the sheriff could be summoned. Sarah clung to her mother, finally crying now that the danger had passed. "This is my fault," Eleanor said quietly as she hammered nails. "If I just left, if you just left, you would be giving up your home and your claim and your children's future because a rich woman wanted what you have. That is not right. That is not justice." But a man died. A man died because he took money to burn a cabin with children inside. He made his choice. Now he lives with the consequences. Or does not live, as the case may be. Arthur's voice was hard. "Do not waste sympathy on people trying to kill you." Eleanor looked at him, this hard man who had entered her life like winter wind and changed everything. "How do you live with it, the violence, the death?" "I do not live with it. I just survive it. There is a difference." Arthur set down his hammer. "This world is not kind, Eleanor. It does not reward goodness or punish evil with any consistency. It just is. You can fight to make your corner of it better, or you can surrender to those who would make it worse. Those are your choices. I chose fighting a long time ago. And you have been alone ever since. Yes. Does it have to be that way? Fighting and alone forever?" Arthur looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the question beneath the question. "I do not know. Never found anyone willing to stand in the fire with me long enough to find out." Eleanor held his gaze. "I am still here. After everything. Still here." Something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond words. They had been through combat together, had faced death and come out the other side. That created bonds that normal life could not forge. "Yes," Arthur said quietly. "You are." The next week brought a flurry of activity. The territorial marshal arrived, investigated the shooting, and ruled it justifiable defense. The dead mercenary was buried in the town cemetery over Mrs. Whitmore's objections. The remaining attackers were questioned and released for lack of evidence, but everyone knew what they had done. Mrs. Whitmore herself remained invisible, conducting her business through intermediaries, but her influence was waning. Miller's public stand had emboldened others. Shop owners who had refused Eleanor's service began nodding when she passed. Not friendly, not yet, but no longer overtly hostile. Arthur filed the silver claim, officially listing Eleanor as primary owner. The news spread through town like wildfire. The worthless Chen homestead was potentially valuable, very valuable. Suddenly, people who had scorned Eleanor wanted to discuss partnerships, investments, development opportunities. Eleanor refused them all. The vultures who had watched her starve now wanted to share her fortune. The hypocrisy was staggering. But the claim brought its own problems. Mining required capital, equipment, expertise. Eleanor had none of these things. Arthur had some money saved, but not enough for a full mining operation. They needed a partner, but finding one they could trust was proving impossible. 2 weeks after the attack, Arthur and Eleanor sat at her table after the children had gone to bed, reviewing numbers that did not add up, no matter how many times they calculated. "We could take a loan," Eleanor suggested, "from who every bank within 100 miles is connected to Whitmore in some way. They would loan you money, then foreclose the moment you missed a payment. Then what do we do? Sit on a fortune we cannot access." Arthur was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke, his voice careful. "I have a proposal, business proposal. Hear me out before you answer." "All right. I have $8,000 saved, 15 years of living cheap and selling cattle. It is enough to start a small mining operation. Buy basic equipment, hire 3 or 4 men, begin extraction. Not enough to do it right, but enough to prove the claim is real and valuable. Once we prove it, we can bring in bigger investors from Denver or San Francisco, people Whitmore does not control. You want to invest in my claim? I want to partner with you. I put up the initial capital. You provide the land and the claim. We split profits 60-40 your favor since it is your land. We work it together. Build something that belongs to both of us. Eleanor studied his face. This is not just about the silver, is it? No, it is not. Then what is it about? Arthur took a breath. This was harder than facing guns. These past weeks coming here, teaching James, fixing your cabins, sitting at your table. This is the closest I have felt to being alive since Margaret and William died. You and your children, you gave me a reason to matter again. I had forgotten what that felt like. He looked down at his calloused hands. I am not good with words. Not good at explaining feelings I do not fully understand myself. But I know that when I leave here, the ranch feels emptier than it used to. And when I come back, when I see you, when I hear the children laughing, something in me eases. Something I thought was dead forever. Eleanor reached across the table, placed her hand over his. I feel it too. This connection. But I do not know what it means. I am not ready to love again. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I am not asking for love. I am asking for partnership. For the chance to build something together to see where it goes. No promises beyond that. And if the silver runs out, if the mine fails, then we fail together, which is better than succeeding alone. Eleanor smiled, tears in her eyes. You are better with words than you think. So is that a yes? It is a yes, partners. They shook hands, formally sealing the agreement, but they did not let go immediately. Sat there hands clasped, looking at each other, both feeling the weight and possibility of what they were beginning. The mining operation began in early spring. Arthur hired 4 men he trusted from neighboring ranches, men who had no connection to Whitmore. They brought in a small steam-powered drill timber for shoring rails for ore cart. Nothing fancy, just functional. The first week of excavation confirmed what Arthur had suspected. The vein ran deep and rich, averaging 20 ounces of silver per ton of ore. At current prices, they were looking at extracting $5,000 worth of silver per month once they got into full production. Maybe more. Word spread. Denver investors sent telegrams. San Francisco mining companies dispatched representatives. Everyone wanted a piece of the Chen Hayes claim. Eleanor and Arthur met with them, all took their offers under advisement and accepted none. They would develop the mine themselves slowly and carefully, maintaining control. Mrs. Whitmore made one last attempt. She filed a legal challenge claiming Thomas Chen's original homestead filing was invalid due to his citizenship status. The case went before the territorial judge. Arthur hired a lawyer from Denver, expensive but skilled. The case was dismissed. Homestead law was clear. Race was not a disqualifying factor. After that, Whitmore gave up, or seemed to. She withdrew from town affairs, spent more time in Denver, eventually sold her Silver Pine holdings, and moved away entirely. Some said she had overextended financially, that fighting Eleanor had cost more than she could afford. Others said she just could not stand losing. Either way, by summer, she was gone. The town changed slowly. Miller's public stand had opened a door. More people walked through it. Not everyone. Not quickly. But enough that Eleanor could shop without being spat on, that James could walk through town without being jeered at, that Sarah could play with other children without their mothers pulling them away. It was August when Arthur came to dinner and found Eleanor waiting on the porch instead of inside. She looked nervous, her hands twisting in her apron. Something wrong? Arthur asked. No, nothing wrong, but I need to talk to you before you go inside. Arthur dismounted, concerned. What is it? Eleanor took a breath. These past months working together, building the mine, raising the children with your help, it has been good. Better than good. It has been what I needed when I did not know what I needed. I feel the same. I know you do. I see it in how you look at James when he masters something you taught him. How you smile when Sarah shows you her drawings. How you and David work together in companionable silence. You love them, not as a neighbor, as something more. I do, Arthur admitted. They feel like mine even though they are not. And me, Eleanor's voice was quiet. How do you feel about me? Arthur chose his words carefully. I feel like I am alive again. Like the world has color instead of just gray. Like waking up has purpose beyond just getting through another day. Is that love? I do not know. I loved Margaret. That was fire and passion and intensity. What I feel for you is different. Steadier, deeper, like bedrock instead of flame. Maybe that is love. Maybe it is just partnership. I do not know what to call it. Eleanor stepped closer. I do not need it to have a name. I just need to know if you want it to grow, if you wanted to see where it goes. More than anything. Then I have a question. Eleanor's hands were shaking. Arthur Hayes, will you marry me? Arthur froze. Of all the things he had expected, this was not one of them. I know it is not proper for the woman to ask, Eleanor continued quickly, but nothing about us has been proper. And I am tired of waiting for the world to give me permission to be happy. I want to marry you, not because I need protection or money or help with the children, though all those things are true, but because I want to build a life with you, want to wake up next to you, want to grow old together, want to be partners in everything, not just the mine. She looked up at him, vulnerable in a way he had never seen her. You do not have to answer now. You can think about it. I just needed to say it out loud before I lost my nerve. Arthur cupped her face in his rough hands. Yes, 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 I will marry you. Yes, I want to build a life with you. Yes to everything. Eleanor laughed relief and joy, mixing with tears. Arthur kissed her, then gentle and careful their first kiss, and felt the last of the ice around his heart finally melt. The children came running out of the cabin, having been watching through the window. They swarmed around their mother and the man who would become their stepfather, everyone talking at once, joy bubbling over in ways that had been impossible 6 months ago. The wedding took place in September, simple and small. Reverend Cole officiated in the cabin that had been rebuilt and expanded with silver money. The church board had reinstated him after Mrs. Whitmore left town, the congregation voting overwhelmingly in his favor. His sermon about the Good Samaritan had become legendary, repeated in saloons and Sunday schools alike. Miller served as witness. A dozen townspeople attended, the ones who had found the courage to choose right over easy. Among them stood Tom Whitmore, now 17, no longer under his mother's control. He approached Arthur before the ceremony began. Mr. Hayes, I need to say something. I knew what my mother planned. I should have warned you. I was a coward. Arthur studied the young man for a long moment. You are here now. That takes a different kind of courage. We all start somewhere. Tom nodded, his eyes wet, and took his seat among the guests who had chosen principle over comfort. Eleanor wore a dress she had sewn herself from fabric Arthur had bought in Denver. Arthur wore a new suit, the first he had owned in 20 years. James, David, and Sarah stood with them, part of the ceremony, as Arthur formally promised to be their father in every way that mattered. After the ceremony, as the guests ate and talked and celebrated, Arthur stood on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains. Eleanor joined him, slipping her hand into his. Regrets, she asked. Not one. Scared? Terrified, but in a good way. Eleanor laughed. I know what you mean. They stood in silence, watching the light fade, beginning their life together with the quiet comfort of two people who had found each other against impossible odds and chosen to hold on. 6 months later, in early spring, Eleanor stood in that same spot with news that would change everything again. She was pregnant. At 31, she would have another child. Arthur's child. When she told him, Arthur went pale, then red, then pale again. His hands shook. For a moment, Eleanor feared he would collapse. But then he pulled her close, held her tight enough that she could feel his heart hammering, and whispered against her hair, I will not lose you. I will not lose this child. I swear it. You will not. We have money for doctors now, for medicine, for everything we need. I will hire the best doctor in Denver. We'll bring him here a month before the due date. We'll have everything ready. Eleanor pulled back to look at him. Arthur, I will be fine. We will be fine. But she understood his fear. Understood that Margaret's death still haunted him, that the specter of loss never quite left. So she let him make his preparations, hire his doctors, build the additions to the house that would accommodate a growing family. The baby, a girl, was born in October 1887 with a doctor in attendance and Arthur pacing the hallway like a caged animal. When Eleanor and the child both came through, healthy Arthur cried for the first time since William's death, cried with relief and joy and the overwhelming knowledge that he had been given a second chance at everything he thought he had lost forever. They named her Margaret Grace. Margaret for Arthur's first wife. Grace for the miracle that had brought them all together. The years that followed were not easy. Mining was dangerous, unpredictable work. Markets fluctuated, equipment broke, men got hurt. But the Chen Hayes Mining Company prospered despite the challenges. By 1890, it employed 40 men and produced $250,000 worth of silver annually. James grew into a young man serious and capable, taking on more responsibility in the mine operations. David became the company's bookkeeper, his head for numbers invaluable in managing the complex finances. Sarah, showing her mother's gift for healing, began studying medicine, determined to become a doctor despite the obstacles facing women in that profession. And little Margaret Grace grew up loved by parents who had fought for every happiness they possessed, surrounded by siblings who adored her in a house that had expanded from a tiny cabin into a sprawling ranch complex that employed dozens and supported the community around it. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Eleanor and Arthur stood on the ridge above the mine, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. Below, the town of Silver Pine had grown and changed, becoming more prosperous and tolerant, shaped in part by the example the Chen Hayes family had set. "You ever think about how different things could have been?" Eleanor asked. "Every day, if I had not brought that food on Christmas, if you had refused help, if we had not fought back." "But we did. We fought. We survived. We built something." Arthur pulled her close. "We built everything." And they had. A fortune from the ground, a family from loss, a community from hostility, a love from loneliness. They had taken the worst winter of their lives and transformed it into something that would last long after they were gone. The mine would eventually play out as all mines do. The money would be invested, diversified, turned into other enterprises. The children would grow, marry, have children of their own. The ranch would expand. The family would spread across Wyoming and beyond, carrying the name Chen Hayes into the future. But that evening, standing on the ridge as the sun set on another day, none of that mattered. What mattered was the hand in his, the life they had built together, the choice they had made to stand when the world told them to fall. Arthur Hayes, the hermit, who had thought himself dead inside, had learned to live again. Eleanor Chen, the widow the world had tried to erase, had refused to disappear. Together, they had forged something stronger than silver, more precious than gold. They had forged a family, a legacy, a future built on the foundation of one man's choice to bring food in a blizzard and one woman's courage to accept help and eventually demand partnership. The winter of reckoning had passed. Spring, summer, fall, and winter again had cycled through. And through it all, they had stood together, two people who had lost everything and found in each other the strength to reclaim it all and more. As darkness fell and stars emerged one by one in the vast Wyoming sky, Arthur and Eleanor walked back down the ridge toward the lights of home, toward the sounds of their children, toward the life they had earned through courage, partnership, and the simple revolutionary act of choosing each other when the world said they should not. The story of the Chen Hayes family would be told for generations in Silver Pine and beyond, not as a fairy tale, but as truth. The truth that sometimes the broken can heal each other, that sometimes strangers become family, that sometimes the hardest winters give way to the most abundant springs, and that love, real love, the kind that lasts, is not built on passion or romance or ease. It is built on standing together when standing alone would be easier, on fighting together when running would be safer, on choosing each other again and again through every season and challenge. Arthur and Eleanor had made that choice, and in making it had discovered that the greatest fortune is not what you find in the ground. It is what you build above it, together. Years later, when James Chen Hayes brought his own son to visit the ridge where it all began, the old silver mine long since closed, he would tell the boy about a Christmas morning when death seemed certain and a stranger appeared with food and hope, about a mother who refused to surrender and a man who chose kindness over safety, about a town that learned slowly and painfully that humanity mattered more than prejudice. And the boy would ask, as children always do, "But Grandpa, how did you survive when you only had 2 bullets?" James would smile the same quiet smile his stepfather Arthur had taught him and say, "We survived because someone chose to see us as people worth saving. And then we chose to become people worth being." The mine was empty now, but the legacy was full, and that James understood was the only fortune that truly mattered.